Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to Weekly Academics and you're listening to Faiza Inamdar. So today I am back with the next podcast, which will be the 6th chapter, and in this one we'll discuss the Lucknow Pact quite in detail. Now, as per the ICSE syllabus, it is only the impact of Lucknow Pact that is a direct part of the syllabus. But to understand the impact, it is quite important to understand certain other factors related to the Lucknow Pact, and in this podcast we'll discuss all those things. So we'll begin with why the Lucknow Pact was formed, then we'll look into what it exactly was, and we'll look into its drawbacks also, and last and finally, the most important part, we'll look into the impacts of Lucknow Pact. So it is quite important to understand the background of Lucknow Pact to actually understand its impact. Okay, so let's move into it. Now, in the previous chapters, we have studied about Muslim League, their objectives, why was the Muslim League formed. We've also studied the Indian National Congress in depth. So keeping all this that we've studied in mind, we look into why and how important this thing known as the Lucknow Pact is. Okay, so let's move into it. Let's first look into why the Lucknow Pact was formed. So first reason behind the formation of Lucknow Pact is the change in objectives of Muslim League. So now when we studied Muslim League in the previous chapter, we saw that one of their objectives was to promote loyalty among the Muslims towards the British, right? That was one of their major objectives. Now in 1913, they changed their constitution, they amended their constitution and they changed their objectives. And now they started demanding and promoting self-government rather than loyalty towards the British. Okay, that was one major change in their policy. Second was events going on internationally around the globe. Okay, so in this period, it is quite close to the World War I. World War I starts in 1914 and we are in 1913 currently. In this similar period of World War I actually, and in this period, the British government or England, which played a quite important role in the World War I, they had deposed the Caliph or the Khalifa, who was the regional religious head of all Muslims, and he was also the ruler of Turkey. So they had deposed the ruler of Turkey and taken Turkey into their hands. So because of this event that happened, Muslims across the world felt hurt because their religious head was deposed, and thus Muslims in India also felt hurt. So the Muslim leaders in India, they started promoting anti-British feelings among the Muslims. Another way, they started promoting no loyal feelings towards the British. Okay, now moving on to the third reason. This is also another important reason which shows the unity coming up, because it was in this period that the early nationalists and assertive nationalists came together, and it was in this same period that the INC and Muslim League came together, because as we see their demands, their wants are kind of growing similar. Okay, so this promoted a unity, and this is also in the same period the Muslim League was having leaders who were quite liberal. So even they thought of cooperating with the Indian National Congress, and leaders like Jinnah, they were actually admirers of the Congress leaders, and even the Congress had come together. So all these three, assertive nationalists, early nationalists clubbed as INC, and Muslim League, they had started to have the similar demands, and therefore they came together, and that is why the Lucknow Pact was formed in 1916 in the Lucknow session, wherein it was a joint session held between Congress and Muslim League. Leaders from both of them had come, which happened in December of 1916, and it was in this session, which took place in Lucknow, that there was a joint scheme of reforms formed by both Muslim League and INC, and in this joint scheme of reforms, it came to be known as the Lucknow Pact. Okay, so this unity was the reason behind the Lucknow Pact. Okay, so with these being the causes, let's look into the features of Lucknow Pact. These are quite important to understand the drawbacks and most importantly to understand the impact. Okay, so let's look into it. Now there are 8 features or 8 provisions as per the Lucknow Pact, and these were actually the demands that they would be making further on. Okay, so the first most important one is the provincial legislatures. So now they wanted reforms in the provincial legislature, wherein 4/5 of the members were to be elected and 1/5 were to be nominated. And out of the total members of provincial legislature, there was to be a fixed number of Muslim representation, and these Muslim leaders would be elected by separate electorates. Only Muslims would be voting for them, and it would depend province wise. The number of Muslims in the provincial legislature would depend. So like in Punjab, 50% were to be Muslims, in Bengal 40%, in UP 30%, and all these Muslim representatives were to be elected by a separate electorate. Okay, so they wanted a Muslim representation, and in general 4/5 to be elected, 1/5 to be nominated. That was the demand for the provincial legislature. Moving on, they demanded certain reforms in the Imperial Legislative Council. That was the central one at the national level. So the Imperial Legislative Council had 150 members. So they demanded something similar in the Imperial Legislative Council. They said that 4/5 should be elected, 1/5 should be nominated. That means 120 should be elected, 30 should be nominated, and out of these 120 who would be elected, 1/3 of them should be Muslims. Okay, so that means 40 should be Muslims. Okay, third, they demanded for certain powers to be given to the Imperial Legislature. Okay, certain powers to be excluded from the Imperial Legislature. They wanted defense, foreign affairs, making of war, peace and treaty. These were excluded from the control of Imperial Legislature. So they wanted that the Imperial Legislature should be the one to make decision on it and not the English government. Okay, this was the third one. Moving on to the fourth one is the reforms in the Viceroy's Executive Council. Now the members, they wanted that half the members of the Viceroy's Executive Council should be Indians, and these Indians should be elected by the elected members of Imperial Legislative Council. That means by those 120 members of the Imperial Legislative Council. That was the fourth one. I'm doing this in short because this is not a direct part of the syllabus, but it's quite important to understand what happens later. The fifth one was the demand for autonomy of provinces. So they wanted that provinces should have an autonomy in deciding or making decisions in certain specific domains. Everything should not be under the imperial government, but some certain degree of autonomy should be given to the provinces. That was their fifth demand. Sixth, they wanted to safeguard the religious interest, and this is quite an important point to understand. So they demanded a reform that no legislative council, be it Imperial Legislative Council or the provincial ones, they cannot pass any bill or any resolution which affects one or the other community directly, be it Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, anyone. If it affects one or the other community directly, it cannot be passed unless, or I would explain it in a better way, if 3/4 members of that particular community whom this resolution is directly affecting, if 3/4 members oppose it, then the Imperial Legislative Council or the Provincial Legislative Councils cannot pass it. Okay, so they kind of created a communal veto. So if 3/4 members of a community do not agree, then it does not get passed. That was the sixth reform that they proposed. Seventh one was the abolition of India Council. So this was the council of the Secretary of the State for India, which operated from England. So they wanted to abolish this to prevent treasury actually. So they wanted to abolish the India Council of the Secretary of State. That was the seventh one. Eighth and the last one was the separation of judiciary and executive. They wanted complete separation of judiciary and executive, and that no executive should hold any judicial powers. Okay, so these were the 8 demands, 8 reforms in provincial legislatures, imperial legislatures, power of the Imperial Legislative Council, Viceroy's Executive Council, the India Council, separation of judiciary and executive, the safeguarding of the religious interest, and the autonomy of provinces. Okay, with this, just even if you've understood just a gist of it, it's okay, because that is more than enough to understand the drawbacks and the impact. Okay, so first we look into the drawbacks of this Lucknow Pact, and there are 5 major drawbacks. Okay, the first drawback is that the system of separate electorate was still alive. Okay, so separate electorate means that there are still separatist thoughts that are still alive. Okay, and Congress being a secular organization, they would not actually have done this, but now that they are making a compromise, they're coming together against one common enemy, they did that. So people believe that they should not have done it, being secular, but Congress did it. Okay, so this kept the this kept the separate electorate alive. Okay, separatist thoughts still continue. Okay, second one was it provided for Muslim representation, but the Muslim representation was not in proportion with the population. They had too much of representation, whereas the population was not that much in the provincial legislatures. That was the second drawback. Third one was the part of the communal veto. So now they brought in a communal veto which will make good things to be passed quite difficult, because 3/4 members of a community have to agree if a bill is directly related to a particular community. So that hinders the process. That was the third drawback. Fourth drawback was the abolition of the India Council, because the executive branch of the government, that is the governor or the governor generals, they used to report to this India Council, which was the Council of the Secretary of State. Now, if that is abolished, there is no one to keep a check on the executive. That was the fourth one. And the fifth major drawback was that all these reforms, all this pact was made among the leaders. It was made at top level leadership. What the general public wanted was never considered. Okay, so they just did what they thought would be good. The general public was never directly consulted. That was the 5 major drawbacks. To reiterate, separate electorates, the Muslim representation, the communal veto, India Council, and that it was made among the leaders and general public was not considered. Okay, so with this being clear, even if a gist of it is clear, it's quite okay. It's okay if even a gist of it is clear, but I think it's quite clear. It's quite easy to understand. Okay, so now let's look into the most important part, that is the impact, which is a direct part of your syllabus. So there are 3 major impacts of the Lucknow Pact, the good impacts, the significance of the Lucknow Pact. So the first one, a very good one, is it was an important step towards the Hindu-Muslim unity. So if you see, it was the Congress and the Muslim League that came together and they combined into a Lucknow Pact which looked after the interests of both as per them, and this brought a path. It was like a stepping stone towards the Hindu-Muslim unity. And that unity continued till from 1914 to 1922. And certain critics said that the Congress had given in too much into the demands of Muslim League. But then the Congress leaders said that if we are fighting a common enemy, we should not be fighting among ourselves, and therefore it paved a path towards the Hindu-Muslim unity. That was the first major impact. Second impact was that in this period of time, as we've already seen, Hindu-Muslims united, Muslim League and INC united, the early nationalists and assertive nationalists also united. So there was a lot of unity among the leaders, which led to a unity among the general public, and this actually demoralized the government. And all these leaders had realized that if they wanted their demands to be fulfilled, they'll have to present a united political front, which was successfully done by the unification of INC and Muslim League and early nationalists and assertive nationalists, which demoralized the government, and the government would now have to, in one way or the other, they would have to give in to the political and constitutional reforms that were being demanded. That was the second impact. And the third and another major impact was that this led to the gradual development of self-governing institution. So, looking at the unity of the leaders and of the general public, the government was already demoralized, and in this period, Britain was quite much involved in the World War I. And the leaders, Indian leaders, Muslims as well as Hindus, they made it clear that Britain could not expect any loyalty from Indians unless and until their demands were fulfilled. So, in order to get help from the Indians, they had to give in to the demands. And that is how the government made a declaration on August 20, 1917, which is known as the August Declaration. And in this declaration, which they made on August 20, 1917, they said that now their policy towards India would be the gradual development of a self-governing institution. Okay, so there was at least a degree of success when all these fronts got united and worked as a united political front. So these were the 3 major impacts: Hindu-Muslim unity, unity between INC, Muslim League and early nationalist assertive nationalists, which demoralized the government, and third, gradual development of a self-governing institution. So that's it. I know this is a bit of a longer podcast than the others, but this actually covers the entire 6th chapter again, which is the Lucknow Pact. We've done a brief mention of August Declaration also in this. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that this will be quite clear because it's quite easy to understand. The most important part is the impact, because that's the only part that comes as a syllabus. But to understand the impact, it's quite important that you understand the background of it, and therefore I explained it. And now the next podcast will be on the next chapter, which will be dealing with the non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement, and other national movements that happened. Okay, so until then, you're listening to Faiza Inamdar at Weekly Academics, and if you want to listen to something soothing, relaxing, do go on YouTube and search Your Life in My Voice. They're all podcasts made by Dr. Sabiha. Quite relaxing, soothing, beautiful, just peaceful. And yes, until then, do like my podcast, share it with all your friends, and if you have any feedbacks, doubts, comments, put it down in the comments section or DM me at weekly.academics. Until then, you're listening to Faiza Inamdar at Weekly Academics, and I'll get back to you soon with the next chapter. Bye bye, stay home, stay safe, be healthy.